Shalom, this is Rabbi Klein from the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Why don't you change? So often we look at others with expectations that suddenly they will understand something clearly at last and finally change. We might even expect that of ourselves. These expectations are not only unrealistic, but they often conceal the true incremental changes that can and often do emerge in the process of time. If this is true on the level of an individual, how much truer it is on the level of a people. Educating a people is not a generational phenomenon. Rather, it's an historical process that can take decades or even centuries. In our Parashaht, we hear once again a refrain we have heard before. We find the people complaining once again about the water and the food of the wilderness. Why is God taking us to this terrible place, this wilderness, to languish and die? Really, how many times can a people fail to learn? After all they've seen, even water coming forth from a flinty rock, do they not yet realize the secret of faith? To complicate matters even worse, this complaint is not the complaint of a people that just came out of Egypt following the Exodus, but rather are the cries of a people after a 40-year sojourn in the desert. For this younger generation, the reality of the desert is the only thing they actually ever knew. For those 40 years, they had been protected and fed by these divine clouds. What has changed which would engender such a crazy response? Apparently, their crisis seems rooted in the very fact that they must travel a circuitous route to avoid the land of Edom, which is mentioned immediately earlier in the Parsha. At the first moment of challenge, as they finally, after 40 years, approach the land of Israel, they utter the very same words that their parents uttered 40 years earlier. They despair of ever leaving Egypt in the first place, a place that this generation never even knew. Clearly, changing an ingrained perspective of the world takes more than one generation, and miracles and wonders are not enough to change the inner heart of a people or any human being within that people. At first glance, this story is extremely sobering. 40 years in the desert, and the people have learned nothing. Moreover, the response of God is also confusing, adding to their doubt. God suddenly sends fiery serpents into the camp, and these poisonous serpents bite many of them and kill them. In recounting the wilderness experience later in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses mentions specifically that not only did God provide them water and bread, those very things about which they are complaining now, but God also protected them from the serpents and scorpions that were found all around them. Far from instructing the people to fear God, the dangerous serpents of the desert might actually reinforce the very source of vulnerability, which is the source of their complaint. They then implore Moses to intercede, and Moses agrees. God tells Moses to fashion a copper serpent and place it atop a staff. If one is bitten, they should then approach the staff, gaze upon the staff, and they will be healed. How is this at all instructive? That God would command people gazing upon the form of a serpent and be healed seems magical to say the least, or even idolatrous. In fact, in later Jewish history, King Hezekiah will destroy this serpent's staff, realizing that it has become an object of adoration and idolatry. Given these facts, what would God's command possibly mean? While it seems that nothing has changed over generations, in fact, there is something subtle that has changed. The people immediately come to Moses and say the following words: "Indeed, we have sinned." They admit their lack of faith and resolve. What motivates this sudden confession? In suddenly becoming subject to the inherent dangers of the wilderness, perhaps they became sensitized to the miracles performed for them in the previous 38 years. The crisis of the snakes awakens within them the fact of their vulnerability is not rooted in any lacking in God's power, but rather in their own lack of resolve and their own lack of faith. This mindfulness, this ability to connect the present reality in which they find themselves and their own actions reflects considerable growth within the people Israel. Yet, like so many other times in the Torah, they turn to Moses to intercede, and Moses acquiesces to the request. Thus, while the people admit to the error, they still see Moses as the key to the healing. In other words, their heartfelt confession does not immediately lead to any change in behavior. Often people will say that regret without corrective action is meaningless, but it is not true. Regret without corrective action is the beginning of a process, but the process is incomplete. The process of corrective action may happen in an instant, but more often it takes time, sometimes a lifetime. God's response to Moses' prayer not only provides a cure to the physical ailment, but it is also meant to instruct the people, providing them a strategy to move forward. True, Moses creates the brass serpent on a staff, but to be healed, they must first come to the staff, come to the serpent, and then they must gaze upon it. They must participate in their own healing. Nonetheless, this corrective action, this prescription, you would agree it's rather strange, rather peculiar. What does gazing upon an object do? Rabbinic tradition is very adamant that this has nothing to do with magical powers of that object per se. The Mishnah tells us the following: did the serpent kill or did the serpent preserve life? Rather, when the people looked and turned their eyes upward and subjected their hearts to their Father in heaven, they were healed. But if not, they rotted from their snake bites. So the Mishnah is alerting us to this inner meaning of the story that we're reading, and I think the meaning is very instructive for us today. At first glance, the answer to the rhetorical question of the Mishnah, does a snake kill or does a snake heal, would seem affirmative. In the story, serpents do indeed kill, and looking at this object at least seemed to provide a cure, but that's only at first glance. However, if you want to unpack what the Mishnah is saying, it's telling us something deeper. It's teaching us that the fact of the source of danger and the source of healing seems to exist within the same object. So the rabbis are teaching us that the person needed to come before this brass serpent and gaze upon it. To gaze upon the object doesn't mean simply to look at it, but it means to consider what is being seen and what is being experienced. If the person took the time to notice, they might conclude that this reality seems contradictory, even paradoxical. However, this paradox is solved when a person realizes that ultimately one's fate is not determined by merely rational considerations, but by adopting a different framework, a more spiritual framework. And seeing the absurdity of a snake that simultaneously causes death and heals, a person turns their eyes upward. That's what the Mishnah is teaching. This turning their eyes upward is the very corrective action that's required. That they did not turn their eyes heavenward at the beginning of the story was the very cause of the crisis. God can heal bodies, but God cannot force a person to believe. Rather, a person must consider the paradox of the snake, and through this, they might reevaluate their life and their values. Thus, God does not simply heal them in this story, but God is educating them in the ways of faith and personal growth. In our own life and our dealings with others, we should not only accept the reality that change is actually slow, but also we should gently instruct in ways that allow a person to grow personally. Whether it be with our children, friends, spouses, or ourselves, we should understand that each of us are on a journey, and there are times on that journey that we will fall short. While we may assist those who are in crisis, we must at the same time allow them to exercise their own agency to affect the inner changes for which we hope. The same rule applies to each of us. No one can save us from ourselves. We must do the demanding work, and find the perspectives required to make true change. Shabbat Shalom.